Good morning and welcome to Our Issues Milwaukee. I'm your host, Andrea Williams. Coming up on Tuesday, August 12th, you'll have the opportunity to let your voice be heard in the 2014 partisan primary elections. Some of the offices to be elected include governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, representative in Congress, state senator, the odd number districts, as well as Milwaukee County Sheriff. It is my pleasure to have the Democratic candidates in the race for Milwaukee County Sheriff both here today. My first guest is a lifelong resident of Milwaukee. He's been in law enforcement for 37 years and has served as Milwaukee County Sheriff since 2002. The 64th Sheriff of Milwaukee County, David A. Clarke Jr. Good morning, Sheriff Clarke. How are you?
Fantastic. Pleasure to be here.
It is my pleasure to have you here, and you're well known for your tough stance on crime, and I don't know you to really hold your tongue when it comes to saying what you really think about things. So it's going to be interesting to have you here today to talk about all the things that's going on as you go up for re-election. If in fact you are re-elected, what will be your goals moving toward or forward as Milwaukee County Sheriff and for the department as a whole?
Well, the same thing that it's been for the last 10 plus years. All right, I want to be a voice for victims of crime in this community, a voice for law-abiding people. All right, that's what sheriffs do. They represent the people. They represent law-abiding people, not the criminal element and not some of these other special interests that my opponent has wrapped himself around.
Okay, and speaking of your opponent, it's Lieutenant Chris Mays, who, by the way, ran against you 4 years ago, and he has accused you of several things, including being fiscally irresponsible, citing that you're projected to be $4.6 million over budget this year. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, that speaks to his lack of executive level experience that I bring. And you mentioned, and I think it's a good point, he ran against me 4 years ago. He was a lieutenant, a middle manager in the Milwaukee Police Department working at a district station. And in 4 years, his career has not progressed. He doesn't have the resume necessary to lead the largest sheriff's office in the state of Wisconsin. I was a lieutenant in the Milwaukee Police Department for less than 4 years. Not only was I promoted to a command level position, which he has not, but I also was selected and attended the FBI National Academy, which is a leadership development program conducted by the FBI where agencies identify future potential promotees. I was nominated and attended that before I got promoted to captain, and then I was promoted to captain, and he's still stuck. His career is stunted, and that's why he wants to do nothing but mudsling instead of telling the voters, you know, here's my resume, here's why I'm qualified. As for projected budgets, that's a structural deficit put in by County Executive Chris Abele. So on January 1 at 12:01 a.m., I had a $4.6 million hole in the budget. That's a structural deficit before a dollar's even spent. Chris Abele is supporting my opponent. Chris Abele was playing politics with the budget. Chris Abele put in that structural deficit knowing there was no plan, because he should have given me a plan to close that structural deficit. He didn't, and I think he did so to give my opponent some cannon fodder for the upcoming election.
I gotcha. And so is this what you mean when you say the game of politics being put into law enforcement, when your focus and your job is public safety and things of that nature, but yet you have to deal with the politics of budget cuts, etc.? It's
what you have to do, but I'll add this as well. I've been the sheriff for 11 plus years. All right, and I have either balanced every budget I've been given or turned back a surplus. I also turned around the House of Correction when it was handed over to me because it was such a mess. And they had a $5.5 million deficit when they handed that off to me to fix, and in one short year I fixed it. My opponent doesn't want to talk about the 10 or 11 consecutive budgets of either being balanced or turning back surpluses. He cherry picks a year where a supporter of his gives him a, something to whack at me with for this election, and that's the politics of it. But I've been here 11 years. I've put up with this before. This will be my 4th election. I've seen it all. It's politics as usual. People are tired of that. What's important to the people of Milwaukee, and what will be very clear in this election, and I'm glad it's this way, the people will have a very clear choice. Do they want a law and order, tough on crime sheriff like I've been for the time I've been here, or do they want to return this office back to a partisan, political sheriff who has admitted he will keep his head down, who has admitted he'll lead from behind, and he's admitted that he'll become a part of the political class in the Milwaukee area, was I have remained independent of that on behalf of the people of this county. It's going to be a very clear choice.
It's going to be very interesting, to say the least. And you are running as a Democrat, and it's no secret that you have a few views that are considered very conservative. So you have some of your critics who say that you only run as a Democrat to take advantage of the vote in Milwaukee, which Milwaukee is heavily populated with Democrats. So what do you say to that? Because I'm sure that's not the first time you've heard that.
Yeah, and I find that interesting. First of all, there's nothing partisan about law enforcement, about being the sheriff. There are many people who don't think this should be in a partisan cycle. It should be in a nonpartisan, which would be spring. But that's for the legislature to deal with. So it is what it is. I find that interesting that a little over 4 years ago, my opponent recommended and endorsed George Bush to become the President of the United States when he defeated John Kerry. My opponent was photographed, and this came up in the last election, at a rally for George Bush in a Bush t-shirt, okay, which I don't think there's anything wrong with, all right? But for him now to come out and act like he's this, whatever a real Democrat is. I don't know, is George Wallace a real Democrat? George Wallace stood up and said segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Robert Byrd, former senator from West Virginia, all right, an avowed member of the Ku Klux Klan. He was a Democrat. How about Al Gore Sr., Senator Al Gore Sr., who was one of the more outspoken senators at the time and in Congress in opposition to the Civil Rights Act of 1965. The Democratic Party found room under their tent for those Democrats. Now all of a sudden there's some question about whether they can find room for me under that tent because I have some different views when it comes to public safety. Now, I'll say this. I grew up in a household in Milwaukee, two parents who traditionally voted Democrat. Okay, they weren't involved in politics, but you know, they were Kennedy Democrats, Jack Kennedy Democrats, Bobby Kennedy Democrats, Truman Democrats. I'm more in line with that type of Democrat than this rabid wing of the party that's taken over, that has shown no tolerance for any views outside of their talking points, all right? I think for myself, I come to my own conclusions about things in life, and that's how I arrive at these things. Now, there's always, nobody agrees with everybody on every little thing. Right. All right, so the fact that I have an alternative view, and they claim to be the Milwaukee County Democratic Party, because I'm not going to paint this broad brush and say all Democrats, because they're not that way. I get Democratic support. But they claim to embrace diversity, to embrace tolerance and other people's views. I'm the only African-American sheriff in the state of Wisconsin. We only have one. And so this party, and this is just a hand-picked candidate anyway, this really isn't about my opponent, all right? But they are a party that embraces diversity and inclusion, is willing to go out and work hard and sabotage and remove the only African-American sheriff in this state, but at the same time, they want to turn around and say that they embrace diversity. I bring diversity to the Badger State Sheriff's Association in the state of Wisconsin because I'm the only one. Okay. And on the other hand, so we go from what your opponents have had to say about you or your critics, but you got on the other hand your supporters. They refer to you as a constitutional sheriff, and the NRA strongly supports you, and you have been quoted as saying, firearms in the hands of law-abiding citizens save people's lives. Where do you stand when it comes to the gun debate and all of those things that we're constantly hearing about? Well, there's no doubt, and I realize you're just bringing this out for the viewers. Yes. Self-defense is the first law of nature, all right? It's a natural right. The Second Amendment is part of the Constitution. When you mention a constitutional sheriff, what that means is I took an oath. I said I will uphold the Constitution of the United States. Well, I got to prove that. And I can't, it doesn't come a la carte. I can't pick and choose, well, I'll take this right and I'll take that right, and I don't like this one because I don't agree with that. That's for the legislature and the Congress to deal with, all right? It's not for executives. Again, executive level experience that my opponent does not have. would like to take that right out of the hands of law-abiding people. It's not for me to do. Like I said, it's a natural right. Okay, and as for the NRA is people. The NRA is a group of people who are practicing, and not only practicing, but engaging in their First Amendment constitutional protection to engage in political activity and political speech. Mm-hmm. Why would my opponent down them as if they're doing something wrong? He is supported by some very left-leaning radical, One Wisconsin Now, okay, radical groups of people doing the same thing. Now, I might disagree with his supporters' views, but I wouldn't put them down because they're engaging in constitutionally protected political speech and political activity.
Gotcha. So we do know, and we can't ignore the fact that there are a lot of illegal guns out there on the streets, and we're seeing the effects of that right here in Milwaukee. So I'm wondering, how do you feel about the way Milwaukee Police Chief Ed Flynn, along with Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett, are handling the violence that we're seeing, particularly in the city of Milwaukee?
Well, that's interesting. And I don't know. Illegal guns? No, there are people who are using guns for illegal purposes, because there are more law-abiding people who are gun owners mm-hmm. that don't use that instrumentality to engage in violent criminal behavior.
I agree.
All right? But you mentioned Ed Flynn. He's got a tough job, very tough job. I spent 24 years with the City of Milwaukee Police mm-hmm. Department, where I was promoted at least to captain. Ed Flynn has communicated to me anyway that he doesn't think much of my opponent's ability to hold a command position because he hasn't promoted him. All right? Ed Flynn is understaffed. There's some questionable initiatives I think that they're engaging in. I call it the whack-a-mole philosophy. Crime happens over here, you send all your resources over there for a couple of days, and then the crime moves over to this neighborhood, and then you run over to that neighborhood. What we need in Milwaukee is a consistent, visible presence mm-hmm. of law enforcement officers that the residents of these neighborhoods are going to know, and they look and they go, we know these folks are going to be here, these police officers. We trust they're going to support us and have our back. But when they leave and a vacuum occurs, the criminal element moves back in. So I just question that strategy. But again, Ed Flynn doesn't have the resources to employ broken windows policing, okay, quality of life enforcement, which is important to people. Also, there's not the trust between minority communities, Black and Latino, and the police department. That starts at the top, because if the community we serve doesn't trust its law enforcement officers, they're not going to be real willing to work with them. So I would ask, what has my opponent done to improve that relationship between officers in the Milwaukee Police Department? It's through no fault of theirs, because like I said, it starts at the top. Mm-hmm. Has he given Ed Flynn any recommendations as to what Ed Flynn should be doing? I would think not. Because if Ed Flynn had any confidence in any advice from my opponent, he probably would have elevated him several times over the last 4 years.
Wow, and before we run out of time, I have to ask you this because, and I asked you specifically your thoughts on how the mayor was handling the whole scenario of violence in the city for a reason, because it has been kind of talked about that you could possibly be running for mayor come 2016. A few hats have already been thrown in the race, so I'm sure the viewers at home want to know, is that something that you're possibly looking at doing?
Well, first of all, you mentioned Tom Barrett. Tom Barrett is supporting my opponent. Tom Barrett's response to crime and violence in the city of Milwaukee has been to furlough officers. I'd like to know what my opponent's view is on the furloughing of Milwaukee police officers when crime is rising. They do not have, they're understaffed in the Milwaukee Police Department. Nobody's saying they aren't. Okay, mm-hmm. That's not just my opinion. So as it relates to mayor, that's 2016. I'm focused on one thing right now, and it's getting reelected sheriff of Milwaukee County. Law enforcement's in my blood. I bleed blue. I have a sense of urgency about this campaign. I take life one day at a time. So after November, because it doesn't end in August, mm-hmm. I've said that I may sit down with some confidants to discuss the viability of running for mayor. That doesn't mean yes, doesn't mean no. Why would I let the opportunity go by to continue to serve my community that I grew up in?
All right, great way to end this conversation, and I think you've given us a very good view of how you feel, and I wish you the best of luck in your re-election as Milwaukee County Sheriff. Milwaukee County Sheriff David A. Clarke Jr. Again, the primary elections will be held on Tuesday, August 12th. Voting hours are from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. and in-person absentee voting is through August 8th, Monday through Wednesday from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. and Thursday and Friday 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. You can log on to milwaukee.gov or call 414-286-3491 for more information. When we return to Our Issues Milwaukee, we'll meet Sheriff David A. Clarke's Democratic challenger in the upcoming primary, Lieutenant Chris Mays, and we'll do that right after this.